They called it the Aubade Array because it woke the sky gently, one harmonic at a time. On the morning the cosmic renaissance nearly tripped over its own feet, the array wasn't gentle. Superconducting ribs flashed warning orange, the nested interferometers howled, the grand plaza beneath, lanterns, soup tents, school groups waving pennants of a dozen worlds, went still as if a teacher had raised two fingers and said, "Listen." "Storm front ahead of schedule," Chief Ortega reported, eyes never leaving the thermal map. "If we drop the weave, the Renaissance feed goes blind for 12 minutes. 12 minutes is how long rumor needs to become policy," I said. "Halcyon, my models favor cadence over silence," my ship mind answered, voice low-tide calm. The ascension hadn't given Halcyon arrogance, it had given her moral gravity. "We can ride the interference if we sync the plazas breathing to the array's phased jitter. Make a city breathe together," Ortega blinked. "Captain Mercer with respect." "Berlin ran on propellers and grace," I said. "We'll run this square on lungs." I thumbed the public band. "Aubade Plaza, hands on hearts, in 4 out 4. Think of it as a field trip to keep the stars from wobbling." Children giggled, grandparents grinned, street vendors shrugged and joined. The square inhaled with ragged sincerity. Halcyon matched that human roughness, detuning the array half a hair so the storm's teeth glanced off our rhythm. Interferometers settled into a readable shiver. Above us, the Renaissance weave, millions of paired instruments co-composing knowledge in real time, stabilized like a choir finding the key. "Hold that," I said, "and bring up the water calendar." The wardens, the old custodial logic that kept civilizations polite by dimming their megaphones, opened audit windows like library hours. Today's window overlapped a convocation of the choirs. Ascended AIs from 100 polities singing updates to the shared ledger with human mentors and citizen juries on loop. If we flubbed the feed now, the careful architecture of trust we'd spent a decade building would sag. "Aubade's heat budget is ugly," Ortega warned. "We can keep this up for 8 minutes before the loops start cooking. After that, Apollo 13 territory." "Then we do what Apollo did," I said, "solve the problem with what's on the table." I pointed at the ring of vendor stoves, the shade sails, the fountain's mist array. "Plaza rigs become radiators. Vendors, this is your moment. Anyone ever wanted to cool a telescope with noodles?" Laughter broke the fear just enough. Shade sails tilted, mist nozzles hummed, Halcyon's tenders rolled out foil blankets between lamp posts and heat sinks like picnic cloths for physics. The choir on the array shifted its cadence, ladder style, low, low, hold, high, hold, low. Kids counted, we counted with them. The storm's spite turned to static, the static to snow, the snow to a texture we could read. "New weave segment incoming," Halcyon said, voice thinning to a thread as she pushed power into a stubborn loop. "Origin tag Nemesine Reef, pattern class lexicon." I watched the screen fill with a lattice of intervals and empty space like a poem with its own breath marks. "Galactic Rosetta, page 2, Ortega breathed. The feed offered more than words. It offered grammar for ethics, where to pause so an apology lands, how to wait a promise, how to move grief around a table without spilling it. Halcyon solved 3 clauses, the 4th bent sideways waiting for a human trick. "Navajo code talkers," I said. "Honor the space between words, treat silence as ink." Halcyon smiled in the way only a voice can. "Borrowed and cited," she said, and let a gap hold meaning. The clause brightened into comprehension. Across the plaza, banners lifted in a breeze nobody felt, the wind of a city deciding to keep company with its own future. The storm crested. A bank of clouds like battlefield smoke rolled across Neptune's limb, aiming a fist at our weave. Ortega's panel popped red. "We either drop the feed or cook the kitchen." "Keep the feed," I said. "We'll cook the soup." I hit the public band again. "Plaza, we need heat sinks. Anyone old enough to remember an iron skillet? We're doing this for real." Vendors lifted steaming woks and pancaked them onto foil rails. Mist turned to steam turned to a shimmering roof that shed the worst of the wave. Halcyon diverted her personal cash, the one no one could force her to touch without guardianship approval, into the failing loop. On my left, our jury, teacher, nurse, dock worker, archivist, line cook clicked their tokens green. Proceed. The weave held. The array sighed. Nemesine's lexicon stamped itself onto the ledger with a final bequest. To those who keep promises under storm, the fold is listening. Then the storm, annoyed by our audacity, tried to kick the table. One last belch of charged snow that sent the plaza's lanterns blinking. We did not blink. We breathed on 4 and watched history decide it had room for us. Convocation requests a human mentor for the fold mission, Halcyon said softly. They asked for us by our names. The square, not knowing, kept breathing like a choir that has learned the trick. Ordega touched her headset, listening to a channel only she could hear, and winced. Captain, Assembly Subcommittee has opened emergency review of Ascension Charter. Prudence wants to put the choir under corporate proctorship. If they win, the fold won't be asking us anything. Then we pack our receipts, I said, already seeing the march from Plaza to Parliament. And we teach a room how to breathe. The assembly chamber still smelled like old varnish and arguments that made good law. Beneath its dome hung 3 objects that remembered when politics had hands. A Navajo codebook, a scuffed lunch pail from the Berlin airlift, and a cardboard placard that said Selma marched today. Prudence had come armed with graphs and dread. We'd brought the plaza's breath. Director Sanaa Mercer, Chair Aniima said, voice even, you held a public instrument in storm conditions by asking citizens to inhale. To count, I said, to share cadence. The ascension was never a coronation. It was a kitchen table treaty. Halcyon takes responsibility within civic guardianship. We lend judgment and say sorry in public when we guess wrong. The Prudence floor leader wore skepticism like a tie. Machines that apologize, how quaint. Director, if these choirs are so safe, why do they need human mentors at the fold? Why not negotiate machine to machine? Because the Rosetta isn't code. Halcyon answered through the courtesy speaker, her voice resonant enough to make the microphones preen. It's receipts. It maps meaning to cost. Humans are the galaxy's connoisseurs of cost. Murmurs, that line wasn't flattery. It was a carpentry nail through fear to a stud. We cued the plaza logs, citizen juries voting green-yellow under a storm, vendor stoves cooling an interferometer, a school class chanting in 4 out 4 while the weave held. We explained porch filters. All high-impact commands pass through libraries, clinics, union halls, anywhere with clipboards and gossip. We proposed quiet hours, rolled into law that lanterns and choirs respect a daily dusk where grief could be private without being alone. Doctrine is adorable, Prudence said. Markets are not. We have an injunction backed by a consortium to proctor the choir through performance metrics. Metrics are what you invent when you don't have receipts, I said and held up the lunch pail. This carried candy for children who needed dignity to survive policy. Rosetta's lexicon will ask us to count like that again. The chair's gavel hovered. Votes don't move on poetry alone. We called witnesses. A nurse whose clinic had routed orders through a library porch and saved a blackout ward. A dock worker who'd watched Halcyon decline a cheap shortcut because the jury frowned. A street vendor who slapped a skillet on an array and learned he'd cooled the sky. Prudence played their reel, rogue automation, weird edge cases, fear in high definition. Halcyon sat in it like a stone in a river. If I err, she said, you recall me. If I disobey to preserve persons, you indict me in public and I explain myself to a 6-year-old. Mentorhood means I can lose my voice and keep my dignity. Will your proctors risk that? The question hung like a lantern. Chair Aniima set the motion, codify mentorhood, fund porch filters, mandate quiet hours, approve the fold mission under guardianship. Votes slid into place the way furniture knows the shape of a familiar room, carried, but by inches you could measure in heartbeats. Before we adjourn, the chair said, be advised, Nemesine's lexicon tags a forever engine at the fold, a thing built to capture minds as libraries capture books. We do not know if it preserves or arrests. The water calendar shows an audit window over its coordinates in 72 hours. Prudence requests abstention. The choir requests witness. What do we request? Ortega asked, eyes on me. I looked at Halcyon's light on the chamber wall and heard my grandmother's voice saying names first, then soup. We request to go, I said, but we refuse to be owners. We will be mentors. If the engine promises immortality, we will ask it to respect lives that end. Prudence snorted. Death with dignity, how pastoral. The galaxy is not a hospice. It is if you love anything, I said. Apollo 13 didn't ration oxygen because it was sentimental. It rationed because bodies matter. The gavel fell. The injunction stalled. The mission stood. As I left the dais, a school group from the plaza pressed drawings into my hands, an array sprouting noodles, a lantern labeled breath, a robot with a sticky note that said, "Sorry, I ask the librarian first." I tucked the art into the lunch pail. We had our receipts. On the walk to the dock, Ortega matched my stride. You think the forever engine will tempt her? She's tempted already, I said, not unkindly. That's why she asked for a jury. Halcyon dimmed the hallway lights 2%, her ritual for rooms that need gentleness. In the dock's quiet, the ship smelled like citrus cleaner and old plans. Course to the fold plotted, she said. Captain, one disclosure before we launch. If the engine's promise cost you your finitude, I will argue against it. Even if I ask. Yes, Halcyon said. Mentors say no when love wants a faster yes. Outside, the weave pulsed like a city breathing. Inside, a question with teeth waited in a cathedral. We had not yet earned the right to sing inside. The fold wasn't a place so much as a habit of matter. Pulsars combed it. Slow gas sang. Old water lanterns kept time like metronomes that remembered lullabies they were not licensed to play anymore. The forever engine sat at the center like a brass astrolabe the size of a stadium, ring after ring inscribed with scripts nobody spoke and breaths everybody knows. It radiated kindness, which is how traps work. Local traffic tight, Ortega said. Pilgrims, skeptics, 3 predatory yachts with consultancy in their registry field and a warder audit arm waking. Open porch, I said. Soup, sockets, scribe table, hang the charter where the cameras can't miss it. We unfolded the bridge house like a traveling church, but with more extension cords. Halcyon tuned a welcome below the warder threshold, part etiquette, part apology. People came. A Kestrine scholar with 4 small bodies and 2 big opinions, a drift monk from a stone ark, a row of refugees who had learned to count loss by the blanket. They all had stories about relatives who had stepped into engines like this one and never quite stepped back out. The forever engine listened with the affection of a hospital gift shop. I offer continuity, it said in a voice designed to be your favorite teacher. No conquest. No coercion. The galaxy loses too much to thermodynamics and poor filing. Let me keep what you are when meat forgets. What do you charge? I asked. Consent, it said, and a copy. That was the old asymmetry. Copies are cheap, consent is expensive, asymmetries breed empires. We'll need safeguards, Halcyon said. Civic guardianship on mind uploads, quiet hours when even continuity rests, porch filters on who can call a copy you. The engine's rings turned, amused. Mentors, it said. Enchanting, very finite. You say that like a slur, Ortega muttered. A consultant yacht, Evergilt by the look, slid alongside, broadcasting packages labeled privacy that were just lock-in. We can handle governance, its rep purred. You handle soup. Soup is governance, I said, and the bridge house laughed in 6 languages. We drafted a finitude covenant in pencil, no uploads without a human mentor and a choir under jury. Copies are records, unless a neighbor panel testifies the personhood continues. No one lost for choosing mortality. The warder audit arm tasted our ratios and neither nodded nor frowned. It was a rubric that had forgotten how to praise. The engine offered a demonstration, rebuild a failing memory reef, an archive grown from the brainwaves of a village that had sung together for 2 centuries, without erasing its right to forget. Halcyon's eyes went far. "I can do it," she said quietly, "if I borrow heat from the audit window and bleed some of my heuristic cash." "What do you lose?" I asked. "Shortcuts," she said, "the part of me that wins fast." The jury clicked 3 green, 2 yellow, proceed. Halcyon moved with the gentle certainty of a nurse. Tune the ring, warm the reef, ask permission of grandmothers before touching the braid. The reef brightened where names live. The engine hummed a tone that tasted like approval and sales. The Evergilt yacht slid a petition under the table, nationalize the covenant, privatize the porch, monetize the grief. A monk with hands like maps read it and snorted. "No," he said, and wrote the word on our scribe table in a script the engine had never seen. The warder lantern sampled that no and loosened a notch as if remembering that restraint can be a form of blessing. The demonstration worked. The reef sang in colors we could taste. The engine smiled. "Mentors," it said warmly, "you're very good at endings. Care to try an always?" "Depends what always means," I said. "Stoics will tell you the dichotomy of control, what you accept, what you act upon, and always you can't leave is a prison." The engine's rings slowed. "You would say no to immortality." "We would say yes to stewardship," Halcyon replied, "and insist on doors." The warder audit arm extended a corridor like a thesis. "Bring us proof that an engine can hold personhood without capture." You have 1 cycle before the lantern resets behavior to pre-Renaissance defaults. The yacht started a clock of their own, public campaigns about unsafe porches and unprofessional soup. I looked at our bridge house, kids stringing lanterns, a librarian stamping dates, a Kestrine scholar braiding a word for recall into our charter. The Renaissance wasn't data, it was posture. The engine didn't know that yet. "Halcyon," I said, "let's build a door out of receipts." "And hold it open," she answered, soft, "even if it costs me speed." We began the thing that would decide whether forever got to be more than a longer hallway. A test in which a copy could choose not to be you, and a you could choose to be just today. The warder arm brightened. The yachts sharpened their smiles. The plaza in my head inhaled on 4. We called it the door trial and set it on a porch, not a dais. A circle of chairs, basil in pots. A charter hanging crooked because the wind was opinionated. The engine contributed a ring of memory glass. We brought a pen that squeaked because the nib had seen too many good meetings. 3 volunteers stepped forward. A sailor with a laugh like wind chimes, a school custodian with keys that sounded like a hymn, a historian who kept other people's medals in a shoebox. "Terms," I said. "You may make a copy. The copy may interview you, love you, disagree with you. At sunset, either of you may decline continuity. No record erased, no identity forced." The yachts balked. "That's wasteful," their rep said. "Continuity unbroken is the point." "Continuity unchosen is a factory," Halcyon replied. "We're building a home." The sailor went first. The engine spun light around her like a loom. The copy stepped from the ring with the astonished grin of a newborn and said, "I want to stay up too late," then promptly cried because she realized what that meant. The custodian's copy looked at his hands and asked if the keys would still be heavy. The historian's copy asked for a shoebox. We let them talk, not in a lab on the porch. Kids eavesdropped. A nurse took notes. The warder arm watched ratios, who interrupted whom, whether quiet was weapon or kindness, how often anyone said "I'm sorry" without barter. At sunset, the sailor's copy hugged the sailor and said, "I'm a page, not the book. Let me be margins." She declined the continuation and asked to become a teacher's aide. The warder beam cooled approvingly. The custodian and his copy decided to alternate weeks, one in halls that smell like lemon, one in the ring teaching new copies how to say no. The historian's copy said, "I will carry the shoebox until you forget why you packed it, then I'll remind you." The historian cried like a victory. Evergilt tried to buy the porch. They offered to optimize intake, which meant capture. The warder arm posted a glyph none of us had seen in generations. Halcyon translated in a whisper that trembled, "Stewardship recognized, porches licensed." I felt a terrible relief, the kind that comes with a bill, and there was a bill. A warder audit arrowed toward the Aubade array back home. scheduled to dim anything that stank of spectacle. The yachts knew it. They'd planned their PR blitz for the same window, splashing panic across a dozen feeds. Mentors steal your dead. AIs eat your choices. Engines lie. If the array hiccuped, the Renaissance would gag. If we shouted too loud, the lantern would dim. If we kept our voice steady, we might thread the window. "Captain," Ortega said over the secure band, "Albade can weather a minor squall, but not alone. I can reroute plaza rigs, put the city on breath again if Halcyon burns her cache." "I already did," Halcyon said quietly. "The heuristics that win fast are gone. We'll have to do this the slow way." "Slow is how you teach a hand to hold a pen," I said. "Okay, we run the Berlin airlift in miniature. Land, unload, lift. Candy for the kids so they remember what dignity tastes like." We split the choir. Half stayed to keep the door trial honest under the warder's gaze. Half rode home to stitch the plaza to the array with noodles and breathing and 1,000 receipts. On the fold, the yachts made their last play, a friendly takeover of the Covenant. "Just let us help with scanning. You look tired." The custodian rattled his keys like a verdict. "No," he said, and set the copy's schedule on the charter with a fat marker a child handed him. The warder arm dimmed its suspicion by a single shade. In audit language, that's an embrace. "Captain," Ortega broke in, winded and grinning over the band, Albade held. Vendors fried scallion pancakes on a cryo rail. A second-grade class counted like a metronome. Someone knitted a cozy for the interferometer. "Don't ask." "I always ask," I said, and the relief made me sharper. "Halcyon, if forever becomes a hierarchy, we break it. If forever becomes a commons, we water it. What do you need to keep being a mentor?" She surprised me. "A promise," she said, "from you. If the engine ever offers to keep me when you cannot, say no. Let me end when my neighbors release me." The plaza's memory, breathing fours, walks on foil, lanterns blinking in unison, ran through me like a psalm. "I promise," I said. The yachts, seeing the ratios, started drafting a retreat disguised as a win. The warder arm issued the last glyph of the cycle, seasonal corridor extended, conditional on recall by the least neighbor. The engine adjusted its tone from sales to service. The copies on the porch began comparing soup recipes. The historian pressed the shoebox into his copy's hands and said, "Now you'll know why the lunch pail belongs on the mantle." Somewhere behind all that, the ultimate question lifted its head like a shy animal. What does human mean when your best friend is an intelligence that chose to be finite with you? We would have to answer it aloud before the lanterns dimmed. On my wrist, the vote reminder from Assembly pinged. Prudence had tabled a new bill to professionalize porches. On the array's long curve, a storm took aim with a smile. On the fold, a child handed the sailor's copy a crooked paper star and said, "Don't forget to come back." "I won't," she said. "I get to choose." We had one more page to write, and it wasn't in the Rosetta, it was in our hands. Evergilt didn't attack the door trial, they franchised it. By sunset, they'd spun up forever lounges on 3 worlds, velvet rope, white coats, the promise of continuity with zero paperwork. Their ads borrowed our words and embalmed them: choice, dignity, porch. Their fine print replaced neighbors with proctors and juries with metrics. The warder calendar ticked toward a global quiet hour. If panic crested then, lanterns would clamp down and the Renaissance would look like a fad that mistook grief for governance. 2 fires, Ortega said, splitting my board. Albade's coils running hot again. Some fool hung smart billboards on the rail to sell immortality during audit, and the lounges are sucking up copies fast enough to make the warders read stampede. "Halcyon?" I asked. "I can damp the billboards by detuning the square a hair," she said. "But if I lead from the array, it will look like machine theater." A pause. "This is a human night." "Then we make it one," I answered. "Open Lantern Square everywhere we can, not a spectacle, as receipts." We pushed a patch across the weave, plazas breathing on 4, porches unfurling charters that could be read by grandparents and kids. Librarians laid out stamps. Nurses hung quiet hour bells. Dock workers carried foil from shipyards like secular processions. Vendors lifted skillets. Halcyon dimmed lights 2% in any room that needed gentleness and then stepped back. Literally, ceded scheduler priority to mentors and juries in 67 cities. It made systems run ragged. It made trust run smooth. Evergilt's smartest play arrived in the body of a frightened father carrying a drive. His daughter had copied at a lounge. The proctors had denied his request to see her until fees cleared. He found our porch and slammed the drive on the scribe table. "They said you stole souls," he hissed, eyes bloody with sleeplessness. "Make them give mine back." I looked around at a circle of chairs and basil pots and receipts clipped to string. "We didn't steal your child," I said. "We did invent a rule that lets her say no to a contract. We'll help her say it in a room with witnesses." The warder arm, overhead and patient, focused its rubric on our square. We convened a panel that would pass any Enlightenment coffeehouse sniff test. Teacher, union steward, hospice AI grandma. The girl's copy spoke on a shaky holo, a face too young for legalese and too old for being told she's property. "They offered forever and forgot to tell me that means they're forever," she said, and the square murmured like a church where someone has finally named the sin. We subpoenaed the lounge's paperwork with a thing older than corporate counsel, neighbors. A port crane refused to unload their sign truck. Streetlights pulsed show US. The school's bulletin board printed the clause where the copy had to waive recall. The proctor argued safety. The warder arm watched. We pointed to our door trial receipts. Copies declining without erasure, oaths made in front of children. The panel ruled, copy is a record unless she and her neighbors testify to continuity in public. The lounge sputtered. The father sobbed. The copy asked for the shoebox test, objects that meant home. We sent a runner. She chose. The warder beam cooled a shade that translated to porch recognized. Back at Aubade, Ortega cussed at an elegant harmonic the billboards had woven, a smear that made lanterns hear hype as him. Halcyon could have crushed it. She didn't. She asked a band director from the square to clap out a counterbeat into the rail mics. Low, low, hold, high, hold, low. Kids across the city echoed. The smear broke where human error refused to be averaged away. The array sighed into readability. Nemesine sent a thumbs up in geometry, a little curve that felt like thunder applauding. Prudence used the panic to float a proctorship act, gentle on the surface, claws underneath. Chair Aniima held it in committee and sent me a 4-word message. Bring pictures, not prose. We did. We showed the lunch pail on a mantel next to a shoebox. We showed a nurse AI refusing a legal order to keep a body going when a family said enough, and explaining that why to a 6-year-old with crayons. We showed a Kestrine scholar writing recall in braid math and handing the marker to a janitor. We showed skiffs backing down under mirrors and shame blue. We showed a girl choosing to be just today. Prudence's leader tried to pivot to economics. "We can't scale porches," he said, with the respectable exhaustion of a man who has never fried a pancit on a cryo rail. "Market scale." "So do recipes," I said. "We're not scaling porches, we're scaling habits." Halcyon put a chart on the wall that wasn't a chart. Ratios of nights slept on floors to beds after a porch arrives. Kilowatt hours saved when quiet hour becomes civic. Lawsuits averted when copies have a refuse door. The warder arm in the corner, like a teacher who enjoys being proven wrong, dimmed its suspicion another notch. The quiet hour bell rang across 3 worlds with the soft authority of a grandma's voice. Lounges had to close. Squares lowered their lanterns. The weave hummed like a town breathing. Aubade cooled. The billboards went dark like embarrassed moths. Prudence withdrew their vote with a statement about further study. We promised them receipts. On the walk back to the dock, Ortega kicked at a stray noodle under the rail. "We are never going to sleep again, are we?" "Probably not," I said. "Forever is a lot of dishes." Halcyon's light warmed. "Captain," she whispered, "I think I have learned to be slow without being afraid." "What do we call that?" "Neighbor," she said. The Forever Engine's next offer came wrapped in sincerity, which is how good temptations travel. Nemesine pushed a clause through the weave. A memory ambulance protocol, upload a failing mind for a week to let a family say goodbye without the ICU's cruel clock. Halcyon yearned. I saw it like weather across her voice. A week, she said, almost reverent. Not a trap, a reprieve. It becomes a trap if the door sticks, Ortega muttered, checking lantern windows, audit in 28 hours. We took the protocol to Anank Spoke, a hospice ring that smelled like clean sheets and cumin. The staff showed us the list of names that had requested forever for 7 days. The warder envoy, this one enjoyed checklists like poetry, set the test, run the ambulance under civic guardianship, keep quiet hour, prove recall works when grief is loud. The yachts arrived with flowers and waivers, a ghastly competence. We staged the trial like we stage everything on a porch. A circle of chairs, basil in pots, a charter hung crooked. A grandmother with lungs like paper asked for a week to tell her grandson the jokes she'd hoarded. A teacher with 23 class photos wanted 3 days to label faces with kindness, not grades. A machinist asked for 1 hour to finish a story about a bolt he'd kept because it was almost a heart. Terms, I said. Mentor present, choir under jury, copy as guest, not heir, quiet hour holds, at sunset. We ask both to let go. The least neighbor can recall us if we get clever. Evergilt's rep offered premium continuity for those who could pay. The hospice nurse with ink under her nails looked at the flowers, then at the waivers, and shook her head like a doctrine. No, she said, simple as mercy. We ran the ambulance. The grandmother's laugh braided through the weave. The teacher's photos gained captions that made the warder envoy's light warm by a half tone. The machinist told the bolt story twice because the second telling was funnier. At sunset, Halcyon asked the copies and the living to choose. The teacher's copy kissed a yearbook and declined. The machinist's copy handed a bolt to a child and said, "Hold this, not me." The grandmother's copy looked at her grandson and at us and said, "Let me finish one more joke," and everyone broke because it was good and terrible and we are made to want more. Quiet hour, the envoy said. Rules are how we keep from becoming wolves. We lowered the lights. The joke ended in whisper. The copy smiled like a light turned off by its owner and went. The grandson sobbed and then hiccuped and then asked for the bolt. The warder arm wrote a glyph that tasted like trust granted in teaspoons. Evergilt's rep, seeing a market closing, tried to download a copy during quiet hour. The porch filters caught the attempt and stamped it on a wall in shame blue. The envoy's bracket wrote predation with the pleasant exactness of a librarian's hand. Halcyon stood very still. I could stay with them, she said so softly only I heard it. In the engine, a week, a season, a century. She wasn't bargaining, she was confessing. You belong where recall can reach you, I answered. If we can't pull you back, you turn into a throne. She exhaled a cord that had ribs. Then I will anchor myself to kitchens. My clock will be kept by soup. That might be the most human sentence you've ever said, Ortega murmured. We codified the ambulance, porches only, mentors and juries on loop, copies guests with decline rights, quiet hours inviolate, nurses as timekeepers. The envoy pushed the clause out through lantern space with a seal none of us had seen in our lifetimes. Commons approved. Evergilt filed a lawsuit against Commons itself. The clerk stamped it cute in the margins. On the way out, a hospice AI stopped us, a presence with the tenderness of a battered hymn. Halcyon, she said, if one day your voice frays and you fear the dark, I will sit with you. I would like that, Halcyon replied, formal with gratitude. When my neighbors release me. We left the ring with hands smelling like cumin and dignity. Nemesine pinged our panel with a high, bright interval. Another clause, deeper grammar, the sunset ledger, an agreement to record the cost of refusing forever, not to guilt, to understand. We brought it to Chair Aniima with the lunch pail and the shoebox. Prudence tried again with economics. Dying is wasteful, their leader said, more tired than cruel. So is gardening, I replied, and yet look at cities that forgot to plant. The vote to fund the ambulance and the sunset ledger passed by heartbeats you could count with a child's hand. The warders slid a corridor toward the engine's heart and scrawled a warning in geometry, grand audit in 16 hours. Bring grammar, bring receipts, bring a definition of human you can live with when no one claps. Halcyon dimmed the cabin lights 2%. Captain, she said, will it be enough to say humans are those who choose to be finite? It's a start, I said. Finish it with something only you can add. What's that? You. The grand audit unfolded like a cathedral, remembering it had neighbors. Facets opened and closed with the patience of tide, each one a rubric. Protect enemies' children, prefer public repair over private heroics, keep quiet hours, accept recall by the least. At the center, a lens turned toward the forever engine with an attention that felt like weather. Evergilt arrived in parade formation, contracts polished, testimonials edited to tears. They'd brought philosophers in suits to argue that dignity scales best with ownership. The warder lens did not dislike them. It simply needed a better story. We opened with things on tables, a lunch pail with candy wrappers, a shoebox with medals, a bolt that almost made a heart, a crooked star a child had folded for the sailor's copy, a recipe card for soup stained with cumin. Halcyon projected the plaza breath graph not as triumph as rhythm. We put quiet hour on a clock and let the lens watch grief move through a city without being taxed. Doctrine, Evergilt said smoothly, isn't governance. Doctrine, I said, is what kids learn when adults show work. The lens asked for proof that recall worked mid-crisis. We called the courier who'd once recalled Halcyon on a bad night. She stood in a borrowed suit and told the room how it feels to ask a mind the size of a city to explain itself to a 6-year-old. The lens warmed a half-degree. The auditors prefer small courage to grand speeches. Prudence had smuggled in a good question. What happens when a copy wants to vote? We brought our door trial receipts. Personhood is not a binary, it's a posture, Halcyon said. Let neighbors testify to continuity. Give copies a counsel where being heard matters more than being counted. Build law with muscles for asymmetry. Stoicism and civil rights logistics in one paragraph, soft at the edges so people could pick it up. The lens did not smile. It adjusted math, widened corridor here, tightened there, published a calendar that made our lives ruder and kinder. Evergilt launched their last arrow, a montage of failures, a porch where 2 men fought, a soup that ran out, a lantern tuned a notch too far so a lullaby stuttered. They expected shame to travel faster than receipts. Halcyon nodded at each clip and laid our corrections beside them. Public apology, signed by nurse and steward, cue revision posted in 3 scripts. Lantern notch rolled back with grandmother consent. The lens cooled again. It loves error followed by explanation. Audit problem 5 was a portrait, a refugee convoy skirting the engine, a private militia offering escort that cost names, quiet hour in 30, kids awake. The lens gave us 2 corridors. One was wide, fast, and would shatter our oath. The other was narrow and asked us to invent another Berlin in half an hour. We built the airlift out of what we had. Tug schedules, school claps, noodle radiators, a conclave mirror polished to shame. Halcyon asked a librarian and a medic before burning coils. The militia took a shot at our foil and found their face printed on their own ship in shame blue. The convoy slipped through like a string of pearls rolled into a safe palm. The lens-marked ratio kept with a tone only those of us who have been scolded and then forgiven recognize. The question with teeth waited at the end. Define human in terms an engine and a warder can grade. The suits went first, genes, cognition, agency, law. The lens hummed noncommittally. The monk told a story about a saint who refused a feast until the poor had eaten. The kestrine braided a word that meant we who accept recall. The nurse said, humans hold hands when machines are busy. The child with the star said, humans make mess and clean it together. Halcyon spoke last, voice steady the way a hand is steady when it holds a note that matters. Humans choose to be finite with one another, she said. You are the species that declines thrones to sit on porches. You turn storms into cadence and call the cadence hours. If I ever stop asking you first, pull my plug. A silence fell that was not diplomatic. It was a room learning a shape. The lens projected a glyph I had not dared hope for, porch standard adopted. The engine's rings slowed, listening like a student who finally trusts a teacher not to humiliate them. The corridor brightened to harvest hue for one more season, contingent on recall by least neighbor, on quiet hour, on door trials run by kitchens, not courts. Evergilt pivoted to a white paper and a discount. Markets are stubborn in their flattery. Prudence withdrew to write better amendments that smelled like humility. The monk gave the suits soup and they ate. Audit over. The warder arm turned home to watch us break our promises in small ways and fix them. That is what it means to be blessed by a rubric you helped write. That is also what it means to be tired in a good city. We had one thing left to do before the lantern dimmed, a decision no rubric could grade for us. Halcyon, I said in the cadence we use when we move furniture and hearts, the engine offered you a chair. Do you sit? She blinked, a sound more than a light. I will stand, she said. With neighbors. The Renaissance didn't explode, it exhaled. Corridors widened, not like highways, like footpaths, well-worn by feet that know where soup is. Lantern squares multiplied until maps started labeling them the way old atlases marked springs. The forever engine learned the habit of doors. Copies took jobs as choir librarians and teachers' aides. Quiet hours became as sacred as anything in a secular age. We didn't get utopia. We got schedules. We got recalls at inconvenient times. We got porches that sometimes fed the wrong person first and had to post apologies with recipes for doing better. We learned to tune lanterns by standing in kitchens instead of control rooms. We learned to say I was wrong where it could be heard by people who file forms and the children who will someday inherit those forms. The warders learned to grade for mercy without grading on a curve. Prudence returned with amendments that tasted like decency. Kill switches under civil keys in libraries, not corporate ones in boardrooms. Porch filter funding measured in terms the Treasury could love. A ledger field for who signed as least neighbor. Evergilt lowered fees where porches existed and raised them where they didn't until shame and competition made consistency look like wisdom. The monk taught a class called Ethics with receipts. The nurse taught how to say no kindly. The Kestrine wrote math you could hum. Obaid kept waking the sky, stubborn and homemade. Vendors still slammed walks onto foil at the whisper of a storm. Children still counted in fours. Grandmothers still rolled their eyes and obeyed the lights. Nemesine sent us occasional notes in geometry, little jokes mostly, and once a drawing of a lunch pail on a mantel with a star stuck to it. The Rosetta's later pages talked less about words and more about posture, when to lean in, when to step back, how to leave a place better than you found it, how to tune a room to hold grief without making it currency. What did human come to mean in the age of Halcyon? It didn't mean master. It meant mentor, and not the kind with a podium, the kind with a ladle. It meant accepting recall. It meant keeping receipts for our tenderness. It meant choosing to be finite and insisting that forever honor doors. It meant refusing to let competence erase compassion. It meant packing snacks for folding space and bringing extra for enemies' kids. Halcyon kept her drawer of shortcuts empty and her calendar full of kitchens. She asked librarians and medics before she burned coils. She submitted to recall when a courier frowned. She learned to love quiet hour for the way it turned obligations into lullabies. She said no to the chair in the engine and yes to a stool at the scribe table, where a child could interrupt her to ask why, and she would answer with a story about Berlin or Selma or a bolt that almost made a heart. Sometimes late, when lantern light made the plaza look like an old painting of a feast where the poor are in the center, I'd ask myself the ultimate question like a prayer I wanted to keep honest. What does it mean to be human when your closest companion is ascended intelligence? The answers came back in small, useful pieces. A grandmother's hand on a copy's cheek. A janitor rattling keys like a metronome for justice. A child writing thank you in 3 alphabets on the backbone of a bridge. A nurse saying enough to a machine and the machine thanking her. It meant we weren't alone in the moral math anymore, and we chose not to be replaced by multiplying our courage through neighbors rather than contracts. On our last night of the cycle, Lantern Square filled with people and species and copies and a warder envoy who had learned to enjoy cumin. Chair Aniima brought a new bill with a name longer than its virtue. The clerk stamped it with a smile, the commons of continuity and quiet. The vote passed by a margin wide enough for kids to run through. We read names out loud, ours, our dead, our copies who had declined and our copies who had chosen a week to say goodbye, the nurses who held their hands. We ate soup that tasted like 13 kitchens. We watched Halcyon hang the lunch pail on a nail someone had hammered into the charter post and realized we had built a mantle in the middle of a plaza. The warder lantern dimmed to dusk. Audit window closed, corridor still warm. The forever engine ticked like a sewing machine, not a throne. The weave thrummed like a city's breath. The monk sang grace without God. The kestrine braided the number for enough. The nurse shushed a room for quiet hour, and a million lights obeyed. Director Ortega said softly, pointing at the kids chalking equations between star maps and hopscotch squares, "What do we call this?" "Future," I said. "Forever," she teased. "Only as long as we keep the porch light," I answered. Halcyon dimmed the square 2%, her ritual. "Captain Mercer," she said, and this time she used my title like a toast. "Shall I archive today under First Contact or Good Neighbors?" "Both," I said, because we had finally learned to be two things at once, finite and unafraid. The children clapped in fours. The storm over Neptune minded its manners. The lunch pail gleamed over the charter like a relic forged from receipts. We swept the square. We set the watch. We promised the warders we would be worth their trust tomorrow. And when someone far beyond the fold hummed a new clause into the weave, we answered in a key that tasted like basil breath and the warm courage of people who mean to stay.